Alrighty. Welcome to NycosRPG. I'm Jonathan Albin, the game market guru and the game master here at NycosRPG. We are going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects, world building, and this series is called The World in Around 80 Days, and the emphasis on this is building a unique game world for game masters and players to enjoy, and to do so in a relatively short period of time for those who are beginner storytellers and don't have a huge amount of time to invest in it. The idea here is that each of these episodes will carry forth one of the concepts about building a building a game world and a framework for storytelling. And it doesn't matter whether you are doing this for a novel that you're creating or whether you are a game master and you've been playing the same game for a long time, or if this is something that you want to start to endeavor to do on your own for your own purposes. We have had episodes already dealing with the origin of a location. We've talked a bit about the concept of how do you thread a story plot line through the locations, and we've even done an episode on the community identity sheet, the CIS, which was invented specifically for the Nykos mechanism. And I'd recommend you review those if you can when you get a chance. And if you don't know where to find them, you can find them either here on Twitch in our back file of videos, or more than likely you can also catch them on our YouTube channel over at NycosRPG on YouTube. But today's episode is a little bit different in that I'm not going to be bouncing the concepts off of another game master as I have in the past, but in this case I'm going to be just discussing it in general terms. And the reason for this is that the element that we're going to be covering, the making of monsters, is really something that should be in the purview of the storyteller and game master. Now, in most role-playing games, they have a monstrous compendium or a monster manual or a fiend folio or some form of booklet that guides you as a storyteller into what those creatures have as far as attributes, such as what they feed on, their numbers, and all kinds of extraneous information that arguably would, if you were playing within that framework and that worldview, would be rational and coherent for that. But in the case of an adventuring party in a world of your creation, I believe that most game masters would love to have a mechanism that allowed them to create their own unique beasties, their unique flavor and tone and even appearance. And those things are often defined for you in advance by the game system that you're playing. And one of the major benefits of the NycosRPG mechanism is that you are the source. You as the storyteller and game master are the source of everything. And so while there will be eventually an Enchiridion, a book of sorts that will cover all of the various beings and monsters that have been engaged within the world of Nykos, they are not intended to be a structural template by which you must play. Now, I need to verify that my audio is going out. It looks like it is, but I need to double check. So if you're on with me at the time and want to converse, of course you can reach out through our Discord. I am currently ensconced in the ironically named live game channel offline, but that's because another of my players is currently occupying the live channel because they might be doing some online work in the future. But in the meantime, I'm here on the Discord channel. If you are a Patreon member, you have access to that. So that's a hint if you haven't gone over and checked out our Patreon program to see what it is that we're doing as far as building the Nykos experience and expanding NycosRPG out into the community. You might want to check that out. you do join us there, you have access not only to our Discord channel for things like this show, but you'll also have access for our live stream games on Saturdays and Sundays that are uniquely for the Patreon supporters. Alright, done with the shameless plug. Let's get back to the show. The making of monsters. Oh my goodness, pardon me. The making of monsters is a fascinating endeavor, and to give a bit of background, when my son was 10 or 11 years old, he was just starting to become interested in the world of Nykos and was asking what he could do to start his own process. And I gave him permission to draw me an image, and then as he built that image, I would ask him questions about the locale, its food supply, and all the things that we're going to talk about here in a minute. But he was in effect building the monstrous compendium, if you will, for his adventures and the things that he did as a storyteller even at a young age. But those narrative discussions with him were really kind of a key to what we now have in NycosRPG, which is the monster building section. So when we talk about making of monsters, I think we first need to have a real clear understanding of what we mean when we say monster. And in the case of Nykos in particular, NycosRPG in particular, I kind of devised the following. Let me see if I can get this page kind of shrunk down. Okay, so therefore, when we talk about what is a monster, we need to talk about what that is. And so a monster, in narrow definition, and in NycosRPG parlance in particular, is any being or entity that seeks only the destruction of its enemies and is by nature incapable of being tamed, domesticated, or pacified permanently. Certain of these incomprehensibly powerful, or I'm sorry, I'm trying to read and I shouldn't do that. The concept is that the monster is by its own nature incomprehensible powerful, or it is devoid of speech, empathy, or reason, and thereby does not have a desire or an inclination or even the capability of communication with the beings of the world in which they inhabit. Some of them are just purely powerful, some of them don't have the capability for speech, but others are just merely vicious and destructive. If you think of many of the monstrous beasts that you may have encountered in other game systems, the idea here is that the creature just wants to rend and destroy and break and tear up and all of that, and doesn't have any concept of morality, boundaries, borders, and such like. Sometimes they'll have the capability for communication and may even be able to portray the air that they can communicate, but they are generally built in with the concept of being a permanent and inviting danger, constantly wishing to destroy, and therefore even in the narrow places where they might have made arrangements or communication with sentient beings, they have no intention of ever doing other than that which they were purposed. Now, for many role-play games, and even if you go back further than that in role-play and fantasy literature, some of the most intriguing elements of the world were, and to this day many are, the monsters. Terrifying to behold and dangerous to a fault, and perhaps worse, they comprehend the development. Difficult to comprehend. I shouldn't have said that's the third one. I was getting my tongue in front of my eye teeth and couldn't see what I was saying. So, in creating monsters, we have to remember at the forefront that these are not beings that can be negotiated with. There is no end game where they cease being terrible. They want to destroy and they want to dominate. And because of this, they are intractable and give players a real reason to put an end to them. So we're going to look, therefore, at the steps of how to make a monster or monsters within the Nycos mechanism, but we're going to talk first in terms of what it is that defines a monster. I think in many cases role-playing games have sort of missed this portion of the dialogue about monsters, because either they have come into the concept of being a storyteller or game master without there being any absolutes, that there are no defined evil, there are no defined good in the world, and therefore without any boundaries or barriers like that, anything that is monstrous can be negotiated with. Anything that is a horror or deplorable has perhaps one or more redeeming qualities with which the players can interact and thereby liberate the world, liberate the monster from the world, in other words. And so we're going to talk today about some of the different reasons why a monster might exist in your adventure and in your campaign. And realizing what we're talking about here are the intractable, truly destructive, and dangerous beings, we have to realize that what we're talking about here are those things that there are no boundaries to the elimination. Killing a monster is not a bad thing in any case, because at the very least they are a danger and a nuisance to others, and at the very worst they are a world-ending event in and of themselves. So there's a lot of different reasons why such a monstrosity might exist, and we're going to go over them, not in any particular order, but simply the one that I used when I was building out the process. So the first reason that a monster might exist, what its very purpose is that it is a force of nature. It is something that came into being as a result of certain variables and exists solely to destroy. Perhaps it's the end of a cycle of life or immortality. Perhaps it is a mechanism for recycling the beings that are on the world that need to, from time to time, be refreshed. It's really up to you, but the cycle of life for anything can be more convoluted than you think. And when we think in terms of being a biological species, we as humans, especially here on terra firma, pardon me, we are the top of the food chain. I need to make a quick change here. I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. So, this idea that a monster is a force of nature, like I said, either it came into being because of a certain set of conditions that were triggered. Perhaps it's always been there and for the most part has been left alone. Perhaps its operation is sort of in the background and isn't seen as being as dangerous as it is. And when we think here of, as I said, of Earth, we are the top of the food chain, and so there is no villain greater than the human being in the world as we know it. But in the realm of Nycos and in whatever environment you are building your adventure for, the monster could be a force of nature. Perhaps the very biome in which they exist was divine with them in mind as the alpha. Perhaps they are given natural advantages by this setting. For whatever reason, these beings are generally superior in some form or other, and they become a threat to the lives of humans and other sentient beings as a result of their place in the circle of life, so to speak. By putting a monster as a force of nature, yes, it's certainly something that is natural, but it is something that needs to be dealt with in its existence. It simply is there to, as I said, rend and destroy and complete a cycle. They are not there to negotiate or make friends with. You are there to eliminate them. Perhaps on another setting, in another position, the monster you're trying to create is a product of experimentation, exploitation, and manipulation. Perhaps it exists in a specific biome, but for some reason the villainous storyline is guiding them or pushing them into a new environment, and they are specifically there as a science experiment for a madman or a test of the virtue of the people in an area or whatever. The idea here is that somebody, some sentient being or beings, have meddled with the conditions of a creature and pushed it into becoming this unreasoning horror. Now, resolution of a monster situation does not always end in its destruction. For example, in the case of an exploitation situation, simply repatriating them to their natural biome might be a solution to the problem, but that does not get rid of the issues that the monster has. So realize that the being you created, while being adjusted, guided, mutated, altered in some fashion, that being, its ration and its rational position and its purpose in life is simply to destroy, and maybe it physically cannot operate in other fashions. So the reason the creature could exist might be to cause it to be an existential threat to persons in a certain area, and so the villainous people who manipulated them have put them on this course of destruction, and it's the player's obligation to try to move them off of that and get them in the direction they're wanting to go to. That, again, doesn't have anything to do with the being itself. The monster itself is the destructive force, and the manipulators are your true villains in that case. Another example of a monstrous origin, a monstrous purpose, is that it's simply an aberration. Something is caused, it doesn't have to be triggered, it could simply be a spontaneously generated being in some fashion, whether it's been altered or mutated or is actually just simply a biological mistake, random happenstance. The concept, for example, of a rabid wombat or a monstrous mole. These concepts would make it so that its existence doesn't fit in the strategic norm, but neither is it going to be able to be survived as it is and must be dealt with. These can be tragic in terms of tale, how it came to be. It could be an awful set of circumstances. It can be a cautionary tale, warning of the dangers of meddling with things that a person doesn't know about. All of these are ways that the aberration came to be, but once it's established as the monstrous being, it must be dealt with. And one of my favorite processes for bringing a monster into a story is that it has been displaced, or it got lost, or was driven off course, or simply deposited in a specific place. And these can be because of human error. The idea of carrying for example, a sarcophagus from one ruin to a library might actually trigger the awakening of a very horrible beastie within its encasement, and therefore the adventurers must figure out how to put an end to this thing, or to write the conditions to put it back in its imprisonment. But the idea is that the thing is unrepentant and it doesn't want to alter or change. It doesn't have the capability to do so even if it did. And then another way that a monster has a purpose is perhaps it is guarding something even worse. Many times the trope is that there is some precedent evil, something that is going wrong that triggers a catalyst that puts into being the horrible monster. And maybe that monster is there specifically to prevent even further damage to the environment, to the location, to the populace, should that monster's defenses be overrun and then the actual villainous bad thing can happen. The idea here is not necessarily that the monster is redeemable. It certainly isn't. It's still the vicious, horrible thing that we are defining it as, but it might serve a greater purpose, and so therefore it's a matter of the players discovering how it came to be. And of course, the final way that a monster might have a purpose is that it might be the end game of the story. The idea is, for example, of creatures as the Dungeons and Dragons define Tarask, that horrible beast simply exists only to rend and destroy, and it is the player's obligation to do everything in their power to bring that to an end, and that could actually be the culmination of your story. If you built it up as the source of all evils in the area, then certainly by allowing the players to hunt it as a monstrosity and, as I've defined it, make it no longer exist, you have done a great thing, and therefore you have come to the end game of that story. All of these different purposes for monsters help us to get into our head what it is we're trying to accomplish with the creation of it, because if we are trying to create a world-ending monster, it's certainly going to have arguably ineffable powers, indescribable destructive capacity, and a force of dynamic and will that should be nigh unto indomitable, so that the threat that it exists rises to the level that our purpose gave them, which therefore means a creature that is supposed to be a guardian should be really well established in terms of its own defense and its own capacity for continuance, even if it faces lethal damage or whatever. So the marks and the identifiers of this monster can be created in such a way that the players can experience the level of threat, the possibility of demise, and the danger that the monster should represent. Now, when we talk about monstrosities, certainly we can talk about insane individuals, those that have lost their minds, those that are perhaps physically been altered and such, and those are individuals, but I try to differentiate the monstrous from the non-monstrous on that intractable nature, because one of the overarching rules of monstrosities in this definition of a monster is that they have no desire to communicate, to be placated. There are those that will, don't get me wrong, there are those beings that are perfectly fine with a periodic sacrifice because their needs for destruction are much more narrowly defined. But even those are inexorable. They're not going to be stopped by the placation mode. Either they soon tire of that level of acquiescence, or perhaps they actually are just chaotic and choose to do otherwise. Realizing that the very concept of the monstrosity is the intractable gives the players the moral permission to actually be destructive against them. The idea here is that, yes, you can use conditions to cow a being and draw it down to the point where you can capture it, but its desire for destructiveness should never allow it to remain so, and will literally fight back at every opportunity to escape and continue its destructive path. So then the question becomes, what do you do to make an encounter truly monstrous? Well, the first thing you want to do is look at the build process of a persona. Even in the case of a monstrous being, it has an identity and it is recognizable as a specific entity, and thereby we recommend the use of the the persona packet. Not that you'll use all of the places, all of the spaces, if you will, on the sheet, but the idea is that you are building a definite being, and for that purpose you'll want to definitely build out its base values and then look at its traits. Now, the marks that are generally associated to race are actually referring to species, so the monster, of course, can become your species definition. And there are, in the master book, close to 50 different marks or traits that a monstrous being might have. I tend to refer to them in this case as traits to differentiate from a persona, because with the case of marks, they are identifiers and trainable abilities. But in the case of monstrous traits, these are the defining characteristics for it, to the point where they actually will, in most cases, completely obviate the need for skills. Yes, there are some skills that a monstrous being might be able to develop, but the concept here is that their alien nature and their dark intent prevent them from using many of the traditional species marks. Having said that, the list of monstrous marks in the master book is only a portion of all of the possible traits and capabilities that a monster might have. And therefore, even though it seems somewhat limiting, there are 6 spaces for marks, and it's recommended that you maintain at most 1, 2, maybe up to 6 monstrous traits to a species, but only to the level of the intensity that you expect that monster to take on. So, for example, let's go with a very basic concept. A ghoul, for example, a being that eats mortal flesh. It actually prefers to kill and consume those species that are considered to be sentient. This doesn't mean it has to be anything supernatural. When I say ghoul here, I'm referring to the purest form of the word, which is simply something that eats. It's a cannibal. The idea of a ghoul is someone who eats mortal flesh. So perhaps you might give that being night vision so that it can travel in the dark of night without any difficulties. Perhaps you would give it uncanny strength, which in reality you simply would modify the resilience of that being, and therefore you wouldn't actually have to take on a monstrous trait. But let's say you wanted to give it something a little more horrible. Let's say that its hygiene is so bad that it's given a venomous bite. When it attacks, it actually deals additional damage in the form of poison. And that poison damage it might incur even after the bites have been treated. So there's all kinds of ways that you could make the venomous bite as a trait work for a ghoul. Perhaps they have the capability of an aquatic adaptation, so that you can make them a being that operates underwater. Maybe they don't need to breathe because they are very close to, if not completely dead. Again, we're not speaking of supernatural here, we're just speaking of their ability to adapt to an aquatic environment. So perhaps they breathe underwater. These traits then give the monster a different feel than the kind of beings that a player character could interact with or communicate with. Maybe these rules have the ability to monitor and control animals, so they add to the fear factor, not only their ferocity, but that of animals. And remember, the point here is that at no case are these beings working to manipulate or direct the flow of conditions in the battle, but they're converting all of their combat functionality into dealing damage to the enemy, and therefore are a threat to any and all that comes into contact with them. Simply by taking 2 or 3 of those, then you can add in perhaps some traits from, if they are coming from human stock, perhaps they have a few human characteristics, or mortal characteristics, or perhaps they have Eldrin origins and therefore pickups on some Eldrin traits. The point here is that the defining of the monstrosity can be used with as many as 6, but as few as 1 or 2 of the monstrous traits, as long as you also then remember to hold to the reality that they do not attempt anything other than damage dealing because of their very nature as monsters. So once we've determined the monster's racial traits and their conditions, then we want to look at what their processes are and where in particular you might find them. Now, in a persona, this links to place and has to do with their upbringing. In this case, the monstrous place has more to do with the actual domain that they prefer. So that would be, are they found in or around cemeteries because of their desire for human flesh, that they actually dig up dead bodies? Perhaps they are monstrous, they come from the waters, and therefore they are harrying the coastlines. Wherever you choose that location to be, you have the propensity to build out their food source, their lair, or whatever, if they come from that bestial origin that we talked about. If they are forces of nature and they live within the realm of their existence and they've been there the whole time, perhaps they have food sources theirs, they might keep prisoners. We have that's of course up to the director to decide. You also want to consider, when you're building out these locales, what's the propensity for collateral damage? Do these things lair in or around human populations or Grundom caves? What is their primary source for their prey? Are they a response to something that was done by a specific species and therefore they have a particular affinity for hunting that species? That can be played into it as well. But there's some questions that you kind of need to look at when you're building out that locale, and I'm going to give a list of them here as an example. One of the things you might want to consider is, does this monster operate alone, or does it have accomplices, allies, minions? This could even go so far as the local community might be actually offering sacrifices to them to keep them at bay. Perhaps they've already sent out some champions, and those champions have become prisoners and vassals of the monster. Who knows? These are questions you need to ask. Is it a single entity, or does it have a family? Are there groups of them? Are there many, or a single villain monster? When it comes to the locale that you build for them as their lair, is it a singular entry, or do they have a lot? For example, if they do abide in a say, a cemetery, you certainly could enter a cemetery through the gates, but you could also jump the fence. You could go through a broken place in the boundary. Perhaps there's a place that the monster uses as an escape route. These are all things that you need to consider when you're building the monster, not just who he is, but where he is and what he uses for his resources. Perhaps the monster keeps prey for a length of time before it disposes of them. The concept I was mentioning of a sacrifice, perhaps it only needs to feast so often, and the local population has found that they can reduce the number of savage deaths in the countryside by simply bringing someone to feed the beast. Now that brings in some levels of darkness and devilry among your population, but that is perhaps separate from the monster itself. Does it keep prey for its own reasons? Next, because of that, will there be hostages or victims to be found in the lair? Perhaps the courageous adventurers that came from the local town have been imprisoned and are actually being held here, or perhaps they've been gravely injured and are fundamentally bleeding out right in the foyer of where the monster is. The idea here is that when you're building out your locale for either the consequential fight or perhaps the big battle at the end, what kind of an environment do you want to have? You need the players to be divided in their interests as they're trying to rescue folk while actually defeating the monster. Next would be, what kind of clues or hints or suggestions might the players find along the way? For example, let's say you've given the creature a vulnerability to sunlight. Maybe the players have never realized that, so you want to give suggestions of maybe some burned hide or a piece of shed skin or whatever, showing that this is the case, in order for your players to pick up on it and therefore be able to run even different approaches to the case than you might have considered. What about their descendants? Are there any young of the villains of the monstrous type? If it's a creature of nature, if it's a force of nature, it very well might have youngins, so to speak, around that have to be considered or dealt with. Perhaps they are in a less volatile state, maybe they are not yet a threat. These things all have to come into place, as do the possibility of vengeful allies. If you have a town that is fundamentally profiting on the lottery system of sacrifice or whatever, and therefore they're gaining benefit from defeating the monster, perhaps they will avenge themselves on the players. And so this adds additional parts to the story. It really comes down to, in this case, does the story end only with the death of the monster? If the monster is something that's got an ongoing legacy, you kind of have to deal with what those potentials might be and how they might be handled by the players in your games group. All of these lead to a monster ecology, a monster definition that fits its purpose. But I'm going to draw back specifically again to that concept of elimination. If a monster's purpose is to destroy and not anything else, then the players have a duty and an obligation to end that misery in one shape or another. Perhaps they can capture the beast, but if they do, how long are they going to be able to hold it? What are they going to do with it once it's captured? And what happens in the ramifications of its escape? These are all things that have to be played into it when you're building the monsters. But the main point that I'm trying to make here is that the creation of a monster, even just your initial prototype versions, is not a burdensome process. You pick a few monstrous traits, put it into the persona sheet, build the backstory for how it operates. Perhaps it's quadrupedal, maybe it's hexapodal, maybe it's got flight. There's all these things that you could add into its description by the kind of traits that you give it, and thereby change up the player's perception. Perhaps you give them traits that give them a potential Achilles heel. The door is really open for you to determine what you want those monsters to be, because the framework is not built so that the monstrous lists that I created over 50 years are all necessarily mandated for Adventures in the World of Nycos. You, as a storyteller, are able to build those out by choosing your own set of traits and your own choice of what skills they might be availed. For example, if they are sophisticated hunters, they certainly will have a hunting skill, and if they have any age on them all, they more than likely have an advanced hunting skill. So the idea that the adventurers might actually become the prey instead of the hunter is a very real thing in that kind of an environment. So by realizing that the players are meeting the creatures that you're creating for the first time, give you the opportunity to introduce them properly, give them the appropriate scare tactics and skills, and then determine how the conflicts go. There's so much more to this we could go into. Let's see. We've talked about the monsters and how to build a monster, but let's talk about how a monster can be used. I'm gonna go back up to my description a minute ago. Let's look at how each of these monster types might work within your game. So, monster is a force of nature. And in this, I'm just spinning totally off the top of my head. Let's say you are a village along a coast, and wayward teenagers have gone missing along the western shores near the moors. Perhaps your monster is a being of the moors who is protective, very protective of the domain in which it lives. So it does not actually pursue the killing of individuals, but if those individuals have crossed the barriers into the established reign of the moor monster, then now there's a reason for it to exist. It's living as a force of nature protecting the moors. Obviously, short story version would be put up some signs and teach the young not to go there, but that is fundamentally an unsatisfactory solution and doesn't really give a reason to go and hunt this being down. So let's say instead the monster has incidentally killed somebody who is important to the village. It hasn't been just random children, but it might be the mayor's son or the archbishop's niece or goddaughter or whatever. The idea is that the monster in question has become something that is a threat to the local populace and needs to be taken down. Now, in the case of the moor monster, I'm envisioning, just because of the hounds of the Baskervilles, perhaps it's a hound-like beast, four-legged quadruped. Perhaps it hunts alone, perhaps it hunts in packs. That's, of course, up to you as the storyteller, how you would perceive it. But the concept is that I would give it extremely good hunting skills, some understanding of the sense of boundaries. Perhaps it's unable to enter actual sand, which gives the players a means to escape from it should there be problems, runs straight to the coast and therefore avoid the beast even as it's pursuing them. Perhaps it's got a long memory and only hunts those that have crossed the barrier in prior times, so therefore the hunters don't trigger it because it's already on the hunt for someone else. There's all kinds of ways you could go with this kind of a force of nature monster, but ultimately there should be a way for the players to drive it back, kill it off, set parameters, maybe hunt out the adults and leave the young to repopulate. There's all kinds of ways this could go, but that's just an example of a monster as a force of nature. It's just something that simply is going to be there and is going to come back from time to time whenever the locals break whatever that code is. Let's consider a secondary type of monster. Let's go with the monsters that are a product of experimentation, exploitation, or manipulation. Let's look in particular at a being that has been experimented on. Let's say it's a being of the second Genesis that is being modified. Someone's trying to add extra claws, add extra power or toughness or difficulty in killing to a being. The cause of it being a monster would be because it has broken free of those constraints, perhaps killing its creator, perhaps driving people out of a local area, but it is not itself it does not have a motive of creating its own homeland. It doesn't have a motive of doing anything other than destroying. Perhaps it's not comprehending the very nature of its deeds. Doesn't mean it can be taught, doesn't mean it can be educated, but it does give the opportunity for that being to be seemingly rational in certain cases and absolutely irrational and murderous in other cases. This process of making the monster does lend itself to a more civilized area, so perhaps a higher population, therefore a higher body count. Perhaps this being has limitations such as sunlight vulnerability, or perhaps it doesn't like sea air or whatever, so that there are ways in order for the players to get the upper hand and gain information. Remember also that while a monster itself is unreasoning, it doesn't mean that it's not a source of good information or even additional resources. The idea, therefore, of a being that could be hunted down and captured for some reason. Certainly, realize that the capture does lead to opportunities for escape later, which means to sequels and additional story themes and add-on mechanics beyond. But the idea here is that the monster itself was created. We know that that is the case because of story, and then the players are endeavoring to put an end to that monstrosity by whatever means necessary. Let's look at the third option. Monster is an aberration. Let's set this in a desert community. It's along a trade route, and several of the trade routes have lost literally their last goat, their last donkey, whatever the last of the trail, suggesting that the monster is actually opportunistically hunting. But let's say that it's doing something awful to the creatures, maybe turning them inside out, perhaps removing organs. There's all kinds of reasons why an aberration might do what terrible things that it's doing. The idea here is that the players, if they want to overcome this aberration, need to not only study its methods and its environs, but also realize what threats it might pose and what things might be able to help them overcome it. So there's more to it than just simply a monster hunt. Although there's nothing wrong with a really good monster hunt, don't get me wrong. Now let's talk about a creature that's displaced. The easiest way to do this is somebody did a summoning somewhere and it went badly wrong, and now the entity is now in an area unfamiliar to it and it can't get home. It doesn't necessarily intend to negotiate or communicate, but it might in certain circumstances do so to help the players figure out how to get it sent away. Because realize that whether you eliminate the being or you simply remove it from the equation, you have successfully defeated that monster. Maybe this is a science experiment or a mystical event. However you want to couch it, the idea is that this thing, whether it be huge and terrible and grotesque or just crass and a bit of an annoyance, you can therefore literally have the adventurers determine the proper course by determining what they can discover about the being and how it came to be where it is. The next is one of my favorites, and this is the idea of there's something that is guarding someplace that's even worse. Let's say, for example, some form of extra-dimensional being, whether it be in a sci-fi setting or horror setting or even a fantasy setting, the monstrosity is preventing interference with a functional waypoint or a gate or shrine or whatever. The guarding potential is it's almost like we're seeding the adventure for what goes beyond in this case, because we're saying it's guarding something even worse. And so if the players succeed and the monster is destroyed, does the something worse actually appear, or does it quell itself because it no longer has its guardian? These are all things that you as the storyteller can choose to pursue, but the idea here is that the monster itself was the foil, and it's up to the players to handle the monstrosity in and of itself. And then, of course, finally, the big bad evil guy, the monster that needs to be destroyed to end the campaign. Certainly, if you are running a short story, 4 or 5 episodes, surely the monster can be dispatched. But perhaps the end game of that story is only an anchor to another. Perhaps this is only one of a family of beasts. There's all kinds of different varieties of storytelling you could use at this point. But if we were considering the monster at the end of the game, then we're going to consider this to be something that you might give all 6 of its marks to. Perhaps it does have the ability to regenerate and the ability to drain energy from its opponents and fly and occlude with gases and smoke. These are all different possible traits that you might give it, but once you've established what those traits are, the maintenance of them within that one being for that one story is important, because you want to make sure that the party can know that they have accomplished their goal of defeating the monster. So, with that, we are almost to my 1 hour mark. I want to thank you for having been with me during this broadcast. I am Jonathan Albin, and this is NycosRPG. We have talked in particular about the references to the NycosRPG mechanism, which is now available as a fast play version at my website, NycosRPG.com. For additional lore information on the world of Nycos, so you can see some of the potential variety of creatures and monsters that exist within the realm, check out NycosRPG.info, and that's the source. It's my World Anvil account. It has a considerable amount of lore about the story, the iterations, and all of that. If you want to know how you can become a part of our community, I would highly recommend checking out patreon.com/Nykos, patreon.com/Nykos. If you become a member there, you automatically have access to our online roleplay sessions on Saturdays and Sundays. Saturdays at 9 a.m., Sundays at 2 p.m. And of course, the overarching intent is for your games to be better. So if you have any questions or concerns you'd like to ask me about, feel free to leave a comment at the comment section. You can check out my videos. I've got over 700 over at NycosRPG on YouTube, and of course the additional videos that are here on Twitch. Please follow us. Greatly appreciate that. If you can subscribe, we'd love to have you as part of our community, and it really helps to keep this channel daily. And I will see you in the next episode Monday morning at 10 a.m. This is Jonathan Albin, NycosRPG. This has been The World in Around 80 Days. We'll see you next time.